Welcome back to Veil of Night. I'm your host. Tonight's submission is a bit different. It's not just a story, it's a piece of history that was never meant to be recorded. It comes to us from an elderly gentleman named Mr. Holloway, who reached out from a small town in the Appalachian outskirts. Mr. Holloway is in his late 80s now. He told me that for decades, he kept this buried because the people involved were powerful and the things they did were unspeakable. But as he nears the end of his life, he says the weight of what he heard as a young man has become too heavy to carry to the grave. He asked me to keep his exact location. Biggie still fears the remnants of the shadow families that once ruled those hills. He wants this to be a warning. Just because a ritual is old doesn't mean it's dead. He's sharing this now because he believes the cycle is starting again. Tonight, we're talking about the Pichash Puja, the Flesh Eater's ritual. Let's head into the deep woods with Mr. Holloway. I wish I could tell you that I saw these things myself, but I was only a boy of 19 when my grandfather sat me down on the porch and told me why we never, under any circumstances, crossed the northern ridge after the sun touched it. My grandfather was a man of iron. He didn't believe in ghost stories, and he didn't care for supernatural nonsense. But that night, his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't light his pipe. He told me about the winter of 1934. The Great Depression was biting hard, and people were desperate. But in the hollows of the mountain, there was a group that wasn't starving. The Pichash, insular community that practiced what the elders called black magic of the most ancient kind. It started with the disappearances. First, it was livestock. Then, a traveler passing through. People tried to rationalize it wolves, or maybe the mountain just claiming what was hers. But then, my grandfather saw it. He was out late, looking for a stray calf, when he heard the chanting. It wasn't like any prayer he'd ever heard. It was a low, guttural vibration that felt like it was coming from the soil itself. He followed the sound to a clearing where the old stone ruins sat, places that were old even when the settlers arrived. He hid in the thicket, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. In the center of the clearing, there was a fire, but the flames weren't orange or yellow. They were a sickly, pale violet. There were 6 of them, men and women from the town people my grandfather saw at the general store every week. They were stripped to the waist, despite the freezing air, and their skin was covered in symbols drawn in what looked like charcoal and something thicker. They weren't praying to a god. They were calling something up. My grandfather told me that as the chanting reached a crescendo, the ground in the center of the ruins began to churn. It looked like boiling tar. And then a hand reached out, but it wasn't a hand. It was a gnarled, elongated limb with fingers that had too many joints. He wanted to run. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to bolt, but he watched as they brought forward a crate. He couldn't see what was inside, but he heard the scratching. The worshippers began to recite a lineage, names of the dead, going back centuries. They were offering a vessel to the... To this day, I can't explain how he stayed so still. Looking back, he said he felt like the air itself had turned into lead. The creature that crawled out of that hole didn't have a face. It had a wet, pulsing membrane where features should be, and a mouth that opened like a blossoming flower, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. This wasn't a nightmare. It was a physical, breathing reality. One of the men, a local carpenter named Silas, stepped forward. He didn't look afraid. He looked hungry. He knelt before the creature and let it lean into his neck. My grandfather said he didn't hear a scream, just a long, wet, slurping sound. When Silas stood up, his eyes weren't blue anymore. They were black pits, leaking a dark, viscose fluid. He had been chosen. He was the new host for the entity they worshipped. My grandfather finally found his legs when the fire suddenly died out, leaving the clearing in a pitch-black silence that felt heavier than the night. He scrambled through the woods, his clothes torn by briars, not stopping until he saw the lanterns of his own house. He tried to tell the sheriff. He tried to tell a preacher. They both told him he'd had too much moonshine. They rationalized it as a drunken hallucination. But a week later, Silas the carpenter was found in his shop. He hadn't touched his tools in days. He was sitting in the corner, surrounded by the bones of his own family. He didn't fight when they took him. He just looked at the crowd and whispered, "The soil is never full. The Pichash always returns for its dessert." Silas was sent away to an asylum, and eventually, the shadow families moved further into the deep woods. People forgot. Tay, Kayad hit, a mass hysteria event. But my grandfather never forgot. He spent the rest of his life checking the locks on the doors and keeping a circle of salt around the perimeter of the house. I thought he was just an old man lost in his own fears, but 40 years later, after he passed, I was clearing out the attic when I found a jar. Inside was a piece of charcoal and a scrap of parchment with those same symbols my grandfather had described. Under narrate, in his shaky handwriting, was a note. They didn't stop. They just learned to hide better. To this day, I can't explain the feeling I get when I drive past those old ruins on the northern ridge. The air still feels heavy, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear that low, guttural vibration. It's not a ghost story, it's an invitation, and I fear that someone, somewhere, is finally ready to answer it again. That was Mr. Holloway's account of the Pichash Puja. He told me that even now, at 88, he keeps a light on in every room of his house. He says that once you know what's waiting in the dark, you realize that safety is just an illusion we tell ourselves to stay sane. I want to thank Mr. Holloway for trusting us with a secret that has been kept for nearly a century. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the history of those mountains holds many unsolved mysteries that are better left undisturbed. If you have a story that has been passed down in your family, or a nightmare that turned out to be real, I want to hear it. Send your experiences to our email in the description. Until next time, stay safe and keep the lights on.